The wind didn't howl that day. It groaned long and low like something old and tired dragging itself across the frozen acres of Black Pine Ridge. Snow was coming down sideways, sharp as dry salt against her cheeks, but Maggie May Dalton kept walking. One boot sank deep, then the other. Her legs burned, her breath hitched. The cold had teeth, and it had already bitten through her coat, through her scarf, through the last of her hope. Becky stumbled beside her, the youngest boy wrapped in her torn shawl. The little girl Annie clung to the front of Maggie's coat, riding against her wide belly, like a bundled ghost, not moving much, because hunger doesn't leave energy for much more than blinking. Maggie tightened her arm around the girl. If she said it out loud, it would break something inside her, but she couldn't stop thinking it. I don't know if she can feel her fingers anymore. They'd been hiking since dawn, from the broken-down cabin that barely held heat across a mile of snow-choked trail down into Timber Creek. But distance wasn't what hurt. What hurt was knowing this had been their last walk. 2 days without food. No wood left for burning. No milk. No dried beans. No one left to help. Their father gone 3 winters now, their mother buried before spring thaw. Neighbors who used to lend things had stopped looking them in the eye when they passed through town. Nobody wanted to help a big girl sister to 3 mouths she couldn't feed. People said she should have married. People said she was too soft, too heavy, too much. But today wasn't about pride. Pride could freeze. Pride could starve. Pride could die. Children couldn't. So Maggie pushed through the icy sludge and stepped into the center of Timber Creek, where the lights glowed gold behind frosted windows and the warm smell of coffee and bacon drifted from inside the general store. Her stomach cramped painfully. She didn't go to the saloon. She didn't go near the sheriff's office. She walked straight toward Thornton's General Supply, leading the 3 children, like ducklings or strays. Conversations quieted. Boots stopped moving. A couple of ranch hands stepped aside. The bell on the tattered church tower scraped against the wind, sounding tired. Maggie lifted her chin, kept walking. The children clung close, especially little Annie, whose face was hollow in that way only hunger can carve. Maggie stopped in front of the store door. She looked through the window. Shelves filled with flour sacks, beans, coffee tins, jerky blankets, warm light and warm people, people with full hands and full bellies. She felt small, but she was not small. She breathed in slow and ragged and pushed open the door. Heads turned. Margaret Thornton herself stood behind the counter, arms crossed, bracelets clicking against each other like little pieces of kindling. Her lips lifted in a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Well," the woman said, "if it isn't the Dalton girl. Not Maggie, not ma'am, just that big Dalton girl." Maggie's hands shook. No use pretending, no use explaining. "I came to ask," she whispered, "for a little flour. Maybe beans. I'll work it off. I'll sew, I'll clean." Margaret didn't let her finish. "Girl," she said lightly, "you begged last winter. My kindness only goes so far." Someone snickered. Someone else muttered shameful. Annie coughed the kind of cough that sounded too weak to survive. Maggie swallowed hard. The words scraped up like broken glass. "Please," she said. Margaret looked at her children, then back to Maggie. "Where's your man? You know I don't have one." A pause. "Then maybe your problem ain't flour," Margaret said slowly. "Maybe your problem is poor planning, poor judgment, and poor self-control." The laugh that followed was not loud, but it cut deep. Maggie's face flushed hot beneath the frozen air. Then she did it. She dropped to her knees. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't noble. It wasn't brave. It was survival. The floorboards were cold. The children didn't speak. Even Becky stopped breathing for a moment. "Please," Maggie whispered. "I got no other place to go." Silence fell across the store. A boy near the stove said, "Ain't right making a woman kneel." Margaret waved him off. She put herself there. But before anything else could be said, something shifted. Not loudly, not even visibly at first. Just a presence. A tall figure stepped inside, brushing off snow. Deer-hide coat boots, worn smooth, leather-wrapped rifle strapped across a broad back. Gray-flecked beard. Mountain eyes quiet but measuring. Jedediah Boone had entered the room. He didn't look at Margaret. Didn't look at the laughing ones at the stove. He looked only at Maggie, then down at her knees. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through every whisper like dry bark splitting. "You don't kneel out here, ma'am," he said, the words rich, low, and slow. "Not while I'm breathing." Every head turned. Maggie looked up, hair wind-whipped eyes, fierce even through the tears. Jed Boone stepped forward, set a wrapped bundle gently on the floor beside her. Flour, coffee, 3 thick strips of dried venison. Then he looked around the store and said something nobody expected. "I'll be taking care of this family for a while. Anyone got a problem with that, they best think real careful before speaking." No one did. At least not out loud. A stunned silence. Then a door slammed in the back. Someone coughed. Maggie whispered like she barely understood the words. "Why? Why would you help us? Jed?" Boone looked at her for a long, steady moment. "Because," he said quietly, "winter don't get to win every time." He nodded once, picked up the bundle, and turned for the door. Maggie blinked, still kneeling. Then she rose slowly, painfully, and followed him out into the snow. Not rescued, not saved, but no longer alone. And as the door closed behind them, folks in that store felt something they didn't expect to feel on a cold winter afternoon home. The snow had stopped by the time they reached the ridge. Maggie's boots were soaked clean through her fingers, stiff and useless, but she carried Annie the whole way without complaint. Jed walked ahead, cutting a path through the drifts, like he'd done it 1,000 times. Maybe he had. He didn't look back once, not until they reached the edge of the timberline, where his cabin stood like something carved out of the mountain wooden square, quiet and alive with thin wisps of smoke curling from the stovepipe. Inside, the heat slapped her in the face. Not cruelly, just sudden. Maggie stumbled a little from the shock, her knees ready to buckle now that the need to keep going had ended. Jed caught her arm, gently. His hands were rough and warm. "You all right?" She nodded, too tired to speak. Becky followed her inside with the younger boy, her expression tight and guarded, her eyes darting around the room like a fox cornered in a barn. Jed closed the door behind them. Snow blew in, caught in his beard, glinted like frost on stone. "You can freeze a heart long enough," he said quietly, "but sometimes it thaws when you ain't looking." Then he disappeared into the back room, leaving only the crackle of fire and the warm scent of wood smoke behind him. The cabin wasn't large, but it was clean, sparse. A table, 2 chairs, a stone hearth, blankets folded in one corner, a rifle mounted above the mantel. Everything had its place. Maggie eased Annie down onto a cot near the fire, removed her scarf, and peeled off her own wet gloves. Her hands were red and bloated with cold. Her palms burned from returning sensation. Becky stood behind her arms, crossed jaw set. "We shouldn't be here." Maggie didn't answer right away. She turned Annie on her side, rubbed her arms. The little girl's eyes fluttered shut. For the first time in days, her breathing was slow and deep. "He gave us a roof," Maggie whispered, "and food. That's more than anyone else has done." Becky's face darkened. "But why nobody helps like that without wantin' something?" Maggie understood the suspicion. She'd lived with it most of her life, every kindness measured, every gift followed by a cost. But something about Jed Boone felt different. He didn't ask questions. He didn't smile fake. He didn't pity. He just gave. When Jed returned, he was carrying a pot of stew and 4 tin bowls. He ladled quietly, motioned for them to sit. The youngest boy, Ezra, wolfed it down before Maggie could even thank him. Jed sat across from them, saying nothing. Watching. Maggie finally cleared her throat. "You live up here alone?" He nodded once. "Don't need much. What do you do for food?" "Trap mostly. Elk when I can find 'em. Dry it, smoke it." Becky stared him down. "You don't look like a trapper." Jed looked back. Calm. "What's a trapper supposed to look like?" She didn't answer. He leaned back in his chair just enough to show he wasn't bothered. "I figure you'll want to leave in the morning." Maggie straightened. Her muscles ached. "We'll get out of your way. I just needed to warm them up." "I'll find work in town," maybe. Jed held up a hand. "That ain't what I meant." She blinked. "I've got extra space. You stay here for a month. You help with cooking, cleanin', mending. I'll feed the lot of you. Make sure nobody freezes. After that, you go if you want." Maggie stared at him, stunned. Becky narrowed her eyes. "Why would you offer that?" Jed didn't answer for a moment. Then, "'Cause I've been cold before, and hungry, and I've seen what it does to people." Silence settled like dust. Maggie's heart thudded in her chest. A month. Safety. Food. And a man who didn't ask her to earn it with anything but work. "I can cook," she said softly. "I can sew too. Clean real good." He nodded like he already knew. "Then we'll call it even." Becky muttered under her breath, but Maggie didn't respond. She couldn't. Something in her chest ached, not from hunger this time, but from the sudden shift of weight. The weight of carrying everything alone all the time. Maybe she didn't have to anymore. Later that night, after the kids were bundled into the spare bedrolls, Maggie sat by the fire hands, cradling a tin mug of coffee. Jed was carving something small from a block of cedar, his hands precise, careful. She glanced at him. "You're not afraid of having strangers in your house?" Jed didn't look up. "Don't believe you're strangers anymore." The room was quiet again. Then from the back, Becky's voice rose low and firm. "You let your guard down around strangers. You don't live long in this world." Maggie turned. "That's enough, Becky." "She's not wrong," Jed said without emotion. "But I got a hunch you ain't here to rob me." "We're not," Maggie said quickly. "We just didn't have anywhere else." Jed nodded once, set the cedar carving down. It was a bird, unfinished, wings just beginning to shape. "Get some sleep," he said. "Storm'll break tomorrow. Got plenty to do come morning." Maggie helped lay the children down again. She curled up by the fire, the blankets coarse but warm. Sleep came heavy and fast, like a stone falling into a deep well. But in the shadows of her dreaming mind, one thought repeated again and again. You can freeze a heart long enough, but sometimes it thaws when you ain't looking. By the next morning, Maggie would take up a broom. Jed would hand her an axe. And the first sparks of a fragile trust would begin to glow just as another man rode into Timber Creek asking questions about the one who lived in the mountains and once killed a man with a steady hand and a clean shot. The thaw had begun, but so had the danger. The sun broke late that morning, climbing slow behind a curtain of pines. Golden light spilled across the valley like honey over snow. Maggie Mae Dalton stood on the porch of Jed Boone's cabin, her arms crossed over her chest, watching the sky change color. The wind was still sharp, but it no longer cut like it had the day before. Maybe it was just the food in her belly. Maybe it was the fact her little brother had slept through the night without crying out from hunger. Maybe it was the way Jed had nodded to her before heading off into the woods at dawn without saying a word, but somehow saying enough. Inside, the kids were still bundled up. Becky was brushing out her hair with long, angry strokes, pretending she wasn't trying to look at herself in the iron skillet like it was a mirror. Maggie took a deep breath, then stepped off the porch. She wasn't used to this kind of quiet. Not the mountain quiet where the only sounds were her own footsteps and the occasional crack of a branch under snow. Back in town, silence meant someone was judging you, waiting for you to speak first so they could twist your words. Here, it just felt like space. Real space. She chopped wood until her arms burned. Then she dragged water from the pump and hung linens near the fire to dry. All of it helped keep the thoughts at bay, the weight of her body, the whispers of the townfolk, the way their eyes slid off her like she wasn't even worth a full glance. Midday, she put on her boots and walked the mile down to Timber Creek for supplies, Jed's list folded tight in her coat pocket. She hated going into town. The first man she passed squinted, then looked away. The second one, a rancher she used to buy eggs from, nodded politely, but didn't stop walking. When she entered Thornton's store, it went dead quiet again, just like last time. Maggie ignored the hush, walked straight to the counter, and handed over the list. Margaret Thornton took it like it stank. "You living up there now?" she asked, all sugar and poison. Maggie didn't answer. "Man like that Jed Boone, he don't exactly have a clean reputation. Folks say he talks to the trees more than people, that he's not right." Maggie's face didn't move. "He's fed my family more in 2 days than this town has in 2 years. Margaret smiled, cool as creek water. "Well, I suppose even mountain men need housekeepers." Behind her, someone coughed into their hand to hide a chuckle. Maggie turned to see a young woman near the fabric shelf whispering something to her friend. The words weren't loud, but they didn't need to be. Fat Girl finally found herself a man too wild to say no. Maggie felt heat rise in her face. Not shame, not quite. Anger. She gritted her teeth, grabbed the supplies, and left without a word. Back on the trail, her boots crunched hard through the snow. Her shoulders burned with the weight of the sack, but she didn't slow down. By the time she reached the cabin, Jed was back. He glanced at the sack, then at her face. "Saw smoke down by the tree line," he said. "Silas must have come in early." Maggie set the sack on the table. "Who's Silas? Friend of mine. Older than me by 10 years, meaner by 20. You'll hear him before you see him." Almost on cue, a voice called out from the trees, "You leave this cabin to the wolves, Boone." Or is that the sound of a woman actually scrubbing floors? The door swung open, and in walked Silas Harper, gray-haired, barrel-chested, and carrying the smell of pine sap and tobacco. He stopped in his tracks when he saw Maggie, then let out a long whistle. "Well, you've gone and civilized the place," he said. "And here I thought the only thing that could break you out of your cave was a bear with a badge." Maggie didn't smile. "You're the friend, depends who's askin'." Jed introduced them with a nod. Silas looked Maggie up and down, not with judgment, but curiosity. You're the Dalton girl from down near Bitterroot, that's right. You're taller than I imagined. You imagined me, Silas grinned. Boone talks more than he lets on, especially about good pie and bad weather. That night over stew and cornbread, Silas told stories in a voice like gravel and honey. The kids laughed for the first time in weeks. Even Becky cracked half a smile when Silas described getting chased up a tree by a bull elk with no antlers. But just before turning in, Silas's voice lowered. "Ran into a man asking about you in town," he said to Jed. "Tall fella, scar down the side of his face. Called himself Cutter." Maggie stiffened. Jed's hand froze over his coffee mug. "You sure as I'm sitting here?" He's sniffing, asking questions. Said he heard there was a man up here who used to wear a badge and now hides in trees. Maggie glanced between them. "Who is he?" Jed stood slowly. "A memory I was trying to leave buried." No one spoke for a while. Then Becky, quiet all evening, looked up from her bowl. "You brought us into the den of a killer." It wasn't loud, but it landed hard. Jed didn't flinch. "I killed a man once," he said. "That's true, but I didn't lie about it." Silas's jaw tightened. "Man he killed was a thief with 3 hostages and a cocked rifle. Jed was the law back then. Did what needed doing. But that man had a brother," Jed added. "Harlan Cutter. And Cutter doesn't care about justice. He cares about blood." Maggie folded her arms. "Will he come here?" Jed looked her square in the eye. He might. And then for the first time in days, Maggie felt the weight return. Not the weight of hunger, not even the weight of judgment. It was the old weight, the one she thought she'd laid down the minute she stepped into this cabin. The weight of knowing she had children to protect in a world that didn't give second chances. As the fire died low and the wind picked up again, outside Maggie sat in the dark and thought about the town, about the whispers about Jed, and about how maybe, just maybe, taking up space wasn't a sin. "They don't hate you 'cause you're big," Maggie, Silas had said quietly, just before turning in. "They hate you 'cause you take up space they wanted empty." She sat with that long after everyone had gone to sleep. By morning she'd rise early. The shed would need reinforcing. Jed would be gone hunting, and Silas would be sharpening knives. And Becky, still simmering, would overhear something she wasn't meant to hear, something that would crack the past wide open. The morning broke too quiet. No birdsong, no wind. Just a hush over the cabin, like the world was holding its breath. Becky woke first. Her boots were already laced before the others stirred. She crept out to the porch, eyes narrowed toward the tree line, still half expecting a shadow to slip between the pines, long and sharp like a blade. She didn't trust it, this stillness. She didn't trust him either. Jed Boone. Big, silent. Too calm. Too kind for a man with blood on his hands. She knew killers. Had seen one shoot a dog in the middle of the road just for barking too loud. That kind of deadness in the eyes, the cold finality of it. Jed didn't have that, not exactly. But he had something worse. He carried guilt like it was stitched into his bones. Inside the cabin, Maggie stirred. The fire was low, and she wrapped Annie tighter in the blanket before getting up. She caught Becky's glance through the window but didn't call her in. She knew better than to rush Becky when she was brooding. Jed was already outside down near the creek. Maggie spotted him from the window, hunched over, gutting a hair. Steam rose from the open carcass like smoke. "Man's got secrets," Silas muttered behind her. "But he's no monster." Maggie turned. "You're sure I've seen monsters?" Silas poured coffee into 2 mugs, handed her one. "Jed's just a man who broke once. and he's been trying to put himself back together ever since. She took the mug warm between her fingers. What happened? Silas sat down the chair, creaking beneath him. About 4 years ago, he was working as a deputy in a town called Still Hollow. Small place. Nothing but a saloon and 2 churches too close together. She raised a brow. That sounds like trouble already, was he said. A man named Elias Cutter, drunk, broke, desperate, robbed the bank, held a woman and her boy hostage. Jed was first on the scene. Tried to talk him down. Didn't work. Maggie swallowed. So he shot him. Clean shot. Through the eye. Saved the kid. Folks called him a hero for a while. Silas stared into the fire. But Elias had a brother. Harlan. Her stomach turned. The man asking about him. Silas nodded. Harlan was the older one. Calmer. Smarter. But meaner too. When he found out what happened, he swore Jed would pay. Said the law didn't get to decide who lived or died. Maggie sat down slowly, every part of her heavy. Why didn't Jed stay with the law? Keep a badge because he stopped believing in it, Silas said. Said if justice was just a bullet, then he didn't want to carry it anymore. Maggie rubbed her face. The memory of Becky's voice from the night before rang clear in her head. You brought us into the den of a killer. But it wasn't a den. It was a shelter. And maybe the killer wasn't the danger. Maybe the danger was coming for them all, whether they welcomed it or not. The door creaked open. Becky stood in the threshold, arms tight over her chest. I heard every word she said. Neither Maggie nor Silas moved. Becky walked in slowly. So it's true he shot a man. Silas's tone didn't flinch. He did. Her voice cracked. You let us live with him, Maggie stood. He saved us, Becky. He saved your sister. Your brothers. Me. He's given more to us than anyone else ever has. He's still a killer. Silas cut in, voice sharp. And that man he shot had a boy tied to a chair with a pistol pressed to his temple. What would you have done, girl? Waited till someone else pulled the trigger. Becky's eyes flickered, but she didn't answer. She turned and walked out onto the porch. Jed was back before midday, rabbit-skinned boots heavy with mud and thawing snow. His eyes swept the room the moment he stepped in, reading the shift in air like smoke on the wind. You told them, he said to Silas. Silas didn't deny it. Jed set down the meat, wiped his hands on a cloth. You scared, Maggie met his gaze. I should be, but I'm not. He looked at her a long time. Then to the kids still huddled in the corner, drawing in the soot with bits of charcoal. Finally to Becky. She wouldn't look at him. You want me to leave, he said flatly. She didn't speak. You want me to disappear into those woods, keep this blood away from you? Still silence. Maggie stepped between them. She's scared. That's all. Jed looked tired. So am I. Becky's voice came soft and cracking. Are you gonna kill again? Jed didn't blink. I hope not. But if he comes... His jaw clenched. If Harlan Cutter comes for me, I won't let him hurt you. The room was still. Even the wind outside held its breath. Then Jed spoke again, lower this time. Some ghosts don't knock before coming in, he said. They just open the door and smile like old friends. That night, no one slept well. The fire burned low, and Maggie sat close to it, arms around Annie, mind turning like a storm. Becky stared at the ceiling, wide-eyed. Jed sat outside under the eaves, smoking quietly, watching the shadows move between trees. And somewhere down the mountain, too far to see, but close enough to sense the echo of bootsteps whispered through the forest, soft, steady, and patient. By the following morning, the unease would have nowhere to hide. It would show up in the splinters of wood, the way Jed split logs like his life depended on it, the tension in Silas's shoulders, the sudden silence of birds. Maggie would feel it too. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it had become a fortress in waiting, and soon even the children would have to learn what fear really looked like. The axe thudded hard into the log, splitting it clean in two. Jed didn't stop. He barely even paused between swings. His breath came in clouds, steady and rhythmic. He had stacked half a cord of wood already, and the sun hadn't cleared the trees. The rhythm mattered more than the effort. Chop, split, toss. Again. Chop, split, toss. Like he was cutting through more than timber. Like the wood was standing in for something darker. Maggie watched him from the porch, arms crossed, lips pressed tight. She knew that kind of labor. The kind that made your muscles scream but kept your mind quiet. She'd baked through grief, sown through anger, scrubbed through humiliation. You survive however you can. Inside the cabin, Silas and Becky argued quietly over something trivial, how to salt the meat, or whether to boil snow water twice. The tension in the walls was rising like heat. The truth about Jed had shaken Becky deep, and Cutter's name was now a ghost in every corner. But life didn't pause for fear. There was work to do. There's a kind of peace in splitting logs, Jed said, suddenly not looking up. That ain't never come from splitting people. Maggie stepped down from the porch. Then maybe you should stop before your arms fall off. He paused mid-swing, smiled faintly, then set the axe down. His hands were red and blistered. He wiped them on his trousers and walked toward the shed. Maggie followed. I was thinking, she said, we could mend the fence line today. The west end's sagging bad. Jed nodded. That storm last month did some damage. And Annie's been coughing again. Might be smart to chink the gaps in the wall. Cold's slipping in at night. Jed stopped in his tracks and looked at her, really looked. What, she asked. You talk like you've always lived here. She shrugged. Feels like we might. At least for now. The moment lingered between them, warm despite the wind. By midday, Maggie and Jed had mended 3 fence posts, repacked the firewood stack, and started patching the southern wall. Becky, still tense but restless, helped without complaint. Ezra and Annie dragged blankets out to sun in the light. Even Silas seemed less haunted, sharpening a skinning knife on the porch and humming something tuneless under his breath. It almost felt normal. Until the silence changed. It started with the birds. They stopped. Not gradually. Just gone. Like someone had snapped the sound out of the air. Maggie looked up from the wall. You hear that Jed was already moving. He grabbed his rifle and stepped toward the trees. Stay with the kids. Jed, Day, he said, voice firmer. Maggie backed up slowly, watching the woods. A branch cracked. Then another. She turned to Becky, who was frozen mid-step near the cabin door. Get inside. Now. Becky obeyed without argument, grabbing Annie and Ezra on her way in. Silas stood slowly, knife in hand, eyes narrowed. Jed returned a moment later, his face grim. Prince, he said. 2 men. One's heavy. Deep tracks. Not fresh, but recent. Maggie's throat went dry. Could be hunters. Could be, Silas echoed. But I don't think so. They reinforced the door that afternoon. Boarded the windows. Jed set up a bell trap on the ridge and placed a tripwire in the snow halfway between the fence and the forest. Silas double-checked every latch and lock. Maggie boiled water, hands shaking as she stirred. Her mind raced if Cutter was near, if he was watching, waiting. What would she do? What could she do that night after the kids were tucked in and Silas took first watch? Maggie sat beside the fire staring at her blistered hands. Jed sat across from her silent. Finally she spoke. "You think it's him? I think someone's coming. Whether it's Cutter or not, I don't know yet." She nodded slowly. "I always thought, if someone came for me, I'd run." "You still can." She shook her head. "Not now. Not with them." Jed leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "They mean everything to you. They're all I've got." He watched her eyes steady. "You don't give yourself enough credit." "What's that supposed to mean?" "You carry more than anyone should. And you ain't buckled yet." Maggie looked away. "Maybe I'm just too stubborn to fall." He chuckled low and dry. "That ain't a bad thing." They sat in silence for a while. Then she asked, "Do you regret it?" He didn't ask what. "Killing that man," she said. "Do you wish you'd waited, tried harder?" Jed rubbed a hand down his face. "I wish he hadn't forced me to choose." Maggie nodded. "I had a choice," he said. "Kill one man or watch him kill 3 others. I chose the thing I could live with. And now his brother's coming to make sure you can't." Jed didn't answer. Outside, the wind picked up. The bell trap jingled once, then fell silent. Maggie froze. Jed stood, rifle already in hand. But the sound didn't return. Probably just wind. But no one slept easy, and by morning the unease in the cabin had taken root. They would continue working the next day, more repairs, more gathering, more prepping, like they were waiting for a storm they couldn't quite name. But things had shifted. The cabin wasn't just a home anymore. It was a line in the snow. And Maggie was starting to understand something that scared her more than the cold or hunger or the whispers in town. She wasn't just surviving here. She was starting to belong. And that meant she had something to lose. In the coming days, Cutter's presence would become more than a shadow. Silas would hear voices in the trees. Jed would return with blood on his coat. And Maggie would have to choose whether to keep her family moving or stand and fight for a life they hadn't dared to imagine. The snow came heavy that morning. Thick, wet flakes blanketed the valley, blurring the lines between forest and sky. The kind of storm that swallowed sound, that covered tracks, that made even the bravest hunter think twice before setting foot outside. But Jed Boone was already gone. He'd left before first light, his rifle slung across his back shoulders, tight beneath his coat. Maggie had tried to stop him, hand on his arm, voice soft. "You don't have to prove anything," she'd said. "This ain't about proving," he'd replied. "It's about knowing what's out there before it finds us." Then he was gone. Maggie spent the day trying not to watch the door. She chopped onions until her eyes stung. Washed every dish in the cabin, even though none of them were dirty. She stirred stew for so long the bottom of the pot began to burn. Anything to keep from asking the question that lived under her skin: what if he doesn't come back? Becky sat by the fire with Annie in her lap, reading out loud from a Bible she'd found on the shelf. Silas whittled something near the window eyes, flicking to the tree line every few minutes. Ezra played quietly with wood blocks Jed had carved the day before. By afternoon, the wind had picked up. The sky turned gray-green. Maggie stepped out to check the traps near the woodshed and stopped cold. Tracks. Fresh. Not Jed's. Boot prints deep and wide. coming from the east, circling the back of the cabin, then vanishing into the trees. She backed away slow, her breath puffed out in sharp clouds. Inside, she slammed the door shut and slid the lock. "Silas," she called. He looked up from his carving. She didn't have to say anything else. He rose, crossed to the door, and looked through the peephole Jed had built just last week. "You're right," he muttered. "Someone was here." Becky stood now too, her hand on Annie's shoulder. "Could have been a drifter." "Could have been Cutter," Silas said. "Or one of his." Maggie's heart thumped hard. They waited. The sky darkened early, swallowing the ridgeline in shadow. The stew boiled down to nothing. The fire burned low. Every creak of wood set them on edge. Then, just past dusk, there was a thud on the porch, followed by another. And then, the door swung open fast. Jed stumbled in blood soaking his coat, one hand gripping his side, the other still clutching his rifle. Maggie was on her feet before anyone could speak. "Jed." He dropped to one knee, breath coming hard. "They're here." Silas caught him before he collapsed. "We're about a mile north. 2 men. I took one down. The other ran. But he'll be back. And he won't come alone." Maggie's hands flew to his coat, yanking it open. His shirt was torn, soaked in red. The wound was deep high on his ribs. Becky rushed to grab water and clean linens. "You need a doctor," Maggie said, voice tight. Jed winced. "Ain't no doctor gonna get here in time." "You don't get to die," she snapped, pressing a cloth hard against the wound. "Not when we've just started living." Silas locked the door again, then moved to the windows. "If they know where we are, we don't have long. We gotta prepare." Jed tried to sit up, gritting his teeth. "They'll come at night. That's how he works. Like a coyote. All patience and teeth." Maggie wrapped the wound tight, her hands soaked in blood. "Then we don't wait for morning." "What are you saying?" Becky asked. "I'm saying Maggie said standing we get ready. We turn this cabin into something they can't walk through." They moved fast after that. Silas and Becky barricaded the windows with firewood and overturned furniture. Maggie helped Jed into a chair near the fireplace, wrapped another blanket around him, and tucked his rifle within arm's reach. She handed Becky a kitchen knife. "If they get through, you run, take the kids, follow the creek, don't look back." Becky looked like she might argue, but then nodded. Ezra stood close to Maggie's leg. "Are the bad men coming?" She knelt, smoothing his hair. "Not if we can help it." Outside, the wind howled louder now, as if warning them. Then silence. A long, unnatural silence. Maggie's breath caught. And then... The front window shattered inward as something heavy smashed against it. Wood splintered. Glass scattered across the floor. A rock wrapped in cloth tumbled to a stop near Jed's boot. Silas grabbed his rifle, swung toward the opening. "Don't fire yet," Jed said through clenched teeth. "Wait." Another thud, this time at the back door. Then footsteps. 5, maybe 6. Maggie's heart pounded in her ears. She could barely hear Jed's voice. "Men like Cutter don't come to scare you. They come to break what made you whole." She stepped in front of the children, shielding them with her body. Silas aimed through the broken window. A figure appeared just for a second, then ducked back. Jed raised his rifle and fired. A scream tore through the night. One down, the others scattered. For a moment, everything went still again. Then came the return fire bullets slamming into the cabin walls, splinters flying. Silas returned fire. Jed reloaded slow, each movement pained and deliberate. Maggie pulled the kids to the back corner, heart hammering. Stay down. The attack didn't last long, maybe 2 minutes, but it felt like forever. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. Silas peered out the window. They're pulling back. For now. Jed slumped in his chair, sweat on his forehead. They'll come again. Maggie sat beside him, her hand gripping his. So will we. Outside, the storm thickened. The world disappeared behind a curtain of white. Inside the cabin pulsed with heat blood and the breathless stillness of people who had survived one battle and knew another was coming. By dawn, they'd count the bullets, repair the damage, and bury the body in the woods. But the real war wasn't over. Harlan Cutter wasn't done. And as Maggie looked at Jed, wounded, pale, but still breathing, she realized something terrifying. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about holding on to the fragile, impossible thing they'd built here. A home. Morning crept in slowly, like it wasn't sure it wanted to be there. The snow had stopped sometime before dawn, but the cold remained a tight, biting thing that seeped into everything. The trees outside stood like sentinels covered in ice, silent and tall. Inside the cabin, the air smelled like gunpowder blood and boiled coffee. Maggie stood at the front window, her eyes locked on the tree line. She hadn't slept. None of them had, really. Not after what happened. The window was still cracked from the night before, patched with a blanket nailed over the frame. A makeshift bandage for a wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. Behind her, Jed groaned softly from the cot. His bandages were soaked through again. Maggie turned. You're burning up. Jed opened one eye. His voice was rough. I've had worse. She pressed a hand to his forehead. Maybe, but this one's here now. And it's festering. Silas stepped inside from the back door, stamping snow off his boots, a rough canvas sack slung over his shoulder. His face was drawn tight, his beard stiff with frost. Buried the one Jed shot. Didn't recognize him. Teeth like he hadn't eaten in days. Likely one of Cutter's strays. Did you find tracks? Maggie asked. Silas nodded. Plenty. They scattered east. But they'll be back. Next time with more. Becky entered from the small bedroom, rubbing sleep from her eyes, arms wrapped around Annie, who still looked pale and tired. Ezra clung to her leg, silent. No one needed to say it, the walls were closing in. They were boxed in now, 5 against however many men Cutter could gather. Jed was too hurt to stand. The cabin's supplies wouldn't last a siege. And Timber Creek might as well have been on the far side of the moon. Silas leaned against the table, watching them all. Then he said it low and steady. Sometimes the only way out is through the man who's hunting you. The words hit the room like a hammer. Maggie stared at him. You want to go after Cutter? I'm saying, Silas replied. He won't stop. Not after last night. He's testing the fence. Next time he'll tear it down. Jed tried to sit up, but pain shot across his face. We can't just walk into the forest blind. I ain't talking about walking in blind, Silas said. I'm talking about baiting him, drawing him out, making him come to us on our terms. Maggie frowned. You'd risk that, I'd risk it, Silas said, to stop looking over my damn shoulder every time a squirrel sneezes. Jed looked at Maggie. He's right. You're too weak to lift a rifle, she shot back. Then maybe I don't need to be the one holding it. The room fell silent. Maggie's hands balled into fists. So what, you're saying I should go, Jed said. I'm saying you're the only one Cutter ain't expecting. Silas crossed his arms. A woman with nothing to lose. He'll see you as soft, Weak. Maggie's jaw tightened. Let him. Becky looked up sharply. This is crazy. You're not a soldier. You're not— I'm a woman who knows how to hold a shotgun, Maggie cut in. And I've survived worse than men like Harlan Cutter. Jed's eyes met hers. They weren't full of fear, just something heavier. Respect. Then we do this smart, Silas said. We build a trap, lure him, isolate him, and end this before it spills into blood we can't clean up. The next hours were a blur of preparation. Silas scouted the ridge, found a bend in the trees, where the snow drifted high, perfect for cover. Maggie gathered everything they'd need, rope wire and old lantern. Jed lay back white as a sheet, giving directions between fits of coughing. Becky sharpened knives, quietly, methodically. Just before sundown, Maggie changed into a dark coat, packed a knapsack with jerky and a flask of water, and slung Jed's spare rifle over her shoulder. Annie hugged her tightly. Don't go, Maggie knelt. I have to. Why, Maggie's throat tightened. Because if I don't, he'll never stop. He'll never let us live. Annie clung harder. Promise you'll come back. I promise. But promises are like smoke when you're heading into fire. Outside, the world had gone bone quiet again. No wind, no birds, just the crunch of Maggie's boots over snow as she crossed the field alone. She made it to the ridge by moonlight breath fogging in the still air. Silas was already there, hidden under a low brush of pine rifle slung and ready. He nodded once. You sure about this? Maggie crouched beside him. I don't have the luxury of not being. Silas pointed to a tree. You stand there. Say the words we planned. He'll come out if he's close. Maggie stepped into the clearing, heart pounding so loud it drowned out thought. Then she shouted, Harlan Cutter! Her voice cracked through the woods like a whip. Silence. Then I've got what you want, she called. Come get it. Stillness. Then snow shifted, and a voice drifted out smooth as whiskey and just as dangerous. Well now, ain't this something? Maggie raised the rifle. Her hands didn't shake. I'm tired, she said loudly, of being hunted, of being small. A man stepped from the trees, tall, scarred, wearing a long black coat and a grin that didn't belong to anyone human. You're Jed Boone's girl, I'm nobody's girl, Maggie said. Cutter chuckled. That's a shame. He should have taught you better than to shout into the woods like you're not alone. From behind, Silas moved, fast. A shot rang out. Cutter's grin vanished. But he didn't fall. Another figure appeared beside him. Then another. Ambush. Maggie dropped low as bullets cracked through trees. Silas shouted, run, but she didn't run. She turned and fired. One man went down, then chaos. Cutter lunged toward her, knife drawn. Silas fired again, too late. Cutter tackled her to the ground, blade pressed to her throat. His breath smelled like rot. You ain't worth the bullet, big girl. Maggie didn't speak, didn't plead. She reached into her coat, pulled the lantern, and smashed it into his face. Glass. Fire. Screaming. Cutter rolled back, his coat igniting. Silas tackled him. The two men tumbled into the snow, fists and blood and flame. Maggie crawled, coughing, vision blurring. Then black. When she woke, the cabin roof was above her again. Becky's face hovered close, eyes red from crying. You're okay, she whispered. Maggie coughed, chest aching. Where's Cutter? Becky hesitated. Gone. Burned or fled. Silas won't say. Maggie tried to sit, but Jed appeared beside her, voice firm. You rest. You did enough. And Maggie, for the first time in years, let someone else hold the weight. Because now they weren't just surviving. They were fighting back. And the cabin, battered, scorched, but still standing, was no longer a hiding place. It was home. The storm had passed, but its memory clung to everything. The scorched pine needles outside, the twisted remnants of the broken lantern, and the bitter scent of singed leather that still lingered in the cabin. Maggie's wounds were mostly surface bruises, but the ache ran deeper than skin. Cutter had almost killed her. If it hadn't been for Silas and that moment of fury-fueled instinct, she didn't let herself finish that thought. It had been 2 days since the ambush. 2 days of silence. No shots in the night. No tracks in the snow. But no one believed it was over. Maggie sat by the fire, her shoulder wrapped in cloth, watching Jed doze in the rocking chair. His fever had broken sometime after dawn. His face looked hollowed out, pale with exhaustion, but calmer. Like the edge had dulled. Ezra was drawing with charcoal on a scrap of wood beside her. Becky sat near the stove, needle in hand, sewing a tear in one of Silas's coats. Annie hummed a soft tune, one she made up on the spot. The sound drifted through the cabin like a lullaby to ghosts. Silas walked in from outside, brushing snow off his coat. Still nothing, he muttered. No sign of movement. Either they're waiting, or they're gone. Maggie met his eyes. You believe that I believe men like Harlan Cutter don't vanish unless they're dead, or planning something worse. He poured himself coffee, then stood beside the fire, warming his hands. We can't keep this up forever. Cabin's strong, but supplies are low. You and me, we can hold a gun, but these kids... Maggie nodded. We can't ask them to live like this much longer. Silas didn't respond. Then Becky looked up from her stitching. What if we weren't just waiting? What if we started over somewhere else? Maggie smiled, tired. And go where? Becky shrugged. Anywhere that isn't here. Jed stirred, then voice rasping out from the chair. This land has teeth, but it gave us something we didn't have before: each other. Maggie turned toward him. We had each other before. Not like this, Jed said. Not with roots. She wanted to argue, but he was right. For all the danger, for all the fear, this cabin had given them something real. A reason to stay. A reason to fight. Silas leaned against the wall. I know a man south of here. Willard Lorne, old trapper. Owes me a favor. He's got land, safe land, hidden deep between 2 ridges. No roads, no trails. Just a creek, some fields, and nothing else. Cutter wouldn't find you there. Maggie looked up sharply. You saying we should leave? I'm saying... Silas said slowly. You should take the kids. While you still can. Becky dropped her needle. You're not coming. I will, he said. But I'll stay a while longer. Keep an eye out. Make sure the trail's cold. Jed coughed, forcing himself to sit upright. And me, you're in no shape to move, Maggie said. We'll wait till you can stand. Jed shook his head. I slow you down, I'll stay too. Silas is right. The kids need peace. A long silence followed. Then Maggie stood, her voice clear. We leave in 2 days. That night, while the others slept, she walked out into the yard, the snow crunching under her boots. The moon was thin and cold above her, but the stars burned clear. She looked to the woods beyond the fence, dark, quiet, vast, and whispered, If you're out there, we're not afraid of you anymore. The next morning, the work began. They packed food-stitched clothing, repaired the sled. Maggie found an old oilskin map Jed had tucked away and traced the route Silas marked. The journey would be hard. 4 days through rugged hills, frozen creeks, and narrow passes. No certainty of safety, no guarantee they'd make it. But it was a path. Jed sat up for longer stretches now, even managed to take a few slow steps. He refused to let Maggie do all the lifting, and she let him try, though it made her nervous. On the second night, she found him on the porch, staring at the tree line. Still nothing, he said. Maggie sat beside him, wrapping her coat tighter. That should comfort me. But it doesn't, Jed replied. She was quiet a moment. You think he's still out there? I think he ain't done with me yet. Maggie looked down at her hands. I don't want to run forever. Then don't, Jed said. Make this trip for them. Not because you're scared, but because they deserve a life without bullets in the dark. She nodded slowly. Then he said, almost too quiet to hear. You saved me that night. You saved me first. He smiled. Maybe we keep taking turns then. They left the cabin at dawn on the third day. Ezra sat bundled in the sled. Annie clung to Becky's hand. Maggie led the way with Silas' rifle slung across her back. Jed stayed behind at the porch, leaning on the railing, watching them disappear into the woods. The path was narrow, icy in places, winding between jagged rocks and windswept trees. They moved slow, careful, always listening. By mid-morning, Maggie heard it. A sound behind them. A bird call, but off. Too deliberate. She froze. Silas stopped too. Trouble I don't know yet. They scanned the trees. Nothing. But the feeling crawled across Maggie's skin, tight and cold. They moved again, faster now. At dusk, they reached the first ridge. Set up camp beneath a wide pine, wrapped the kids in every blanket they had. The fire was small, the cold brutal, and that feeling still there, watching, waiting. As Maggie sat with her back against a tree rifle on her lap, she whispered aloud, "We're not prey anymore." She didn't know if Cutter heard it, but she hoped he did. Because next time, she wouldn't wait to be hunted. Snow fell like ash, slow and heavy, muffling sound, and swallowing tracks as quickly as they were made. The narrow trail cut through the ridge like a scar, winding between trees and boulders glazed with frost. Maggie led the way, boots punching through snowdrifts up to her shins, rifle strapped tight to her back. Her breath came in ragged bursts, fogging in the cold. Every few steps, she looked over her shoulder, scanning the path behind them. Becky pulled the sled with Ezra bundled tight, his cheeks red and eyes droopy with exhaustion. Annie clung to Maggie's coat, her mittened hand locked in her mother's. Silas brought up the rear rifle, raised every few steps, glancing behind them, eyes sharp. Too sharp. He'd heard it too. They weren't alone. They hadn't been for miles. They're tracking us, Maggie whispered during one of their short stops as she helped Annie sip water from a tin cup. Silas nodded, voice low. 3 of them, maybe more. Keeping their distance, waiting for the right spot, or the right time. Maggie looked toward the dense trees ahead. We can't outrun them. Not with the kids. No, Silas said. But we can make it hurt. They moved again before the cold settled too deep into their bones. The wind had started to pick up, threading between trees, howling softly like a warning no one could translate. Becky's voice broke the silence. Why don't they just come at us? Because Cutter's smart, Silas replied without turning. He likes to watch people squirm first. Wears you down. Then he pounces. Maggie clenched her jaw. I'm done squirming. By late afternoon, the snow had turned wet and heavy, making their progress even slower. Maggie's legs ached. Her arms burned from dragging Annie through the deeper patches. Every sound behind them twisted like a knife in her gut. A broken branch, a shuffle in the brush, a crow flapping overhead. Then they found the cabin. It wasn't much. A squat, rotting structure tucked against the cliffside, half covered in ivy and snow. But it had a roof, a stovepipe, and 4 walls still standing. Shelter. Silas pushed open the door with the butt of his rifle. The hinges screamed. The air inside smelled of damp wood and rodent droppings. Still, it was something. Maggie ushered the kids in first, setting them by the stone hearth. Becky unpacked what little food they had left. Silas scouted a perimeter around the structure, eyes scanning the trees for movement. When he came back, his face was grim. They're close now. Within 100 yards. Could see smoke if we lit a fire. Maggie shook her head. Then no fire. We'll keep them cold, but alive. Ezra whimpered. I'm scared, Ma. Maggie knelt, pulling him into her lap. I know, baby. But you're safe, you hear me? You're safe with me. She looked over to Silas. Tonight, he said, we hold. We make our stand here. Becky gripped the old hunting knife Jed had given her, her face pale but fierce. I won't run this time. No one runs, Maggie said. Not tonight. As dusk fell, they set traps, fishhooks strung at knee height with string bells tied to branches, a snare made from Silas's extra belt. It was crude, desperate work, but it was all they had. Then they waited. The cabin sat like a breath held too long. And then, near midnight, a sound, a crunch, then another. Maggie's breath hitched. She raised her rifle, kneeling by the shuttered window. Silas crouched near the door. Becky shielded the kids with her body in the far corner. Then came the voice. Smooth, taunting. You got brave all of a sudden, big girl. Maggie's blood froze. Cutter. I'll give you one chance, he called from beyond the trees. Lay down your guns, open the door, and I might let the little ones walk. Maggie stepped to the window, voice hard. You had your chance. You lost it when you came for us. A pause. Then laughter. You ain't changed, Boone's woman. Still too stubborn to know when you're beat. Silas muttered. He's trying to get us to shoot first. Show our positions. Maggie didn't blink. Let him try. A shot cracked from the woods, shattering the window. Maggie dropped. Silas fired back one sharp blast, then ducked low. Glass rained down. Annie screamed. Becky wrapped herself around the kids. Another shot hit the door. And then footsteps. Fast. Heavy. Maggie rolled behind the table, fired once through the open window. A scream. Someone hit, then silence again. For 10 seconds. Then the door burst open. A man charged through one of Cutter's, face covered, machete raised. Silas met him head-on, tackled him back against the doorframe. They crashed down hard, tangled in limbs and grunts. Silas struck him twice with the butt of the rifle. The man slumped. Then another. From the back. Through the wall. A crash of rotten wood, and suddenly Becky was screaming. Maggie spun, fired. The man dropped inches from Ezra. Silence. Then breathing. Ragged. Shaking. The cabin stank of gunpowder and blood. Silas locked the door again. 2 down. Maggie's heart pounded in her ears. Where's Cutter? Becky pointed. And there he was, standing just outside the front window, clear in the moonlight, watching, smiling. He didn't run, didn't shoot. He just whispered, "You've got fire, I'll give you that." Then he turned and disappeared into the trees. Maggie collapsed to her knees, her whole body shaking. Not from fear, from fury. Silas dropped beside her. Next time he doesn't get away. Maggie's eyes burned. Next time I won't give him the choice. Outside the snow had stopped, but the chill in the air wasn't from weather. It was the promise of what was still to come. A reckoning. And it would come soon. The sun crept over the ridgeline the next morning, casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing. The cabin half collapsed, reeking of smoke and blood, stood like a ghost. Inside, the aftermath lingered in every broken board and silent glance. Maggie stood at the edge of the tree line, eyes locked on the direction Harlan Cutter had vanished. Her knuckles were raw from gripping her rifle all night, and her body felt carved from stone. She hadn't slept. Couldn't. Not with him still out there. Not after what he'd done. Ezra sat bundled in a corner with Annie beside him, too quiet for children. Becky was tending to a gash across her forearm, clean deep, but not fatal. Silas paced near the door boots, leaving melted prints on the wood floor. He hadn't spoken much since Cutter walked away. They all knew what that meant. He wasn't gone. He was baiting them. Why didn't he finish it? Maggie muttered. Silas didn't turn. Because this is a game to him, always has been. Maggie stared at the snow-dusted woods. He's bleeding. We hit 2 of his men. He's down to scraps. That's when he's most dangerous. She looked over at him. Then we end it. Silas stopped pacing. You want to hunt him, I want to stop running. He watched her, measuring. He wants you to come after him. Good. That night they made a plan. Ezra, Annie, and Becky would stay behind in the cabin, fortified, reinforced, and stocked with what little food they had left. If they didn't return in 3 days, Becky would take the kids and head east toward Lorne's land. Maggie and Silas would track Cutter's path into the hills. No more traps, Maggie said, cleaning her rifle. No more waiting for the hammer to fall. We take the hammer. Silas loaded rounds into his revolver, his voice low. This ends in blood. It already has. At first light, they slipped into the forest. Cutter had left a trail, not obvious but deliberate. A boot print in shallow snow. A broken twig. A strip of cloth caught on a bramble. He wanted them to follow. So they did. They hiked uphill for hours, cutting through dense pine and granite, the air getting thinner, colder. Maggie's breath came hard. Her legs burned, but she never slowed. Not once. By midday, they reached a narrow gorge. The wind howled down from the cliffs, carrying whispers, branches creaking, the soft hush of falling snow, and something else. Faint. Wrong. A whistle. Not a bird. Not wind. Maggie froze. Silas knelt, scanning the rocks. A shot cracked, echoing sharp against stone. Maggie ducked behind a boulder, heart pounding. Silas was already beside her, blood trailing from a graze across his bicep. He's up there. Ridgeline. 70 yards. Can we flank, no cover? He wants us in the open. Another shot hit the stone near Maggie's head. Chips flew. She looked up, eyes narrowing, and shouted, "Is this it, Cutter, hiding like a dog behind a rock?" His voice came down lazy and amused. Just waiting for the right shot. You gonna cry when it lands. Maggie stood, then slowly, deliberately. Silas hissed, "What are you doing?" She raised her rifle. "I'm done letting him speak like a god." Another shot. Missed. Maggie didn't flinch. She aimed high to the shadow on the ridge and fired. A scream. Then silence. Silas blinked. "You hit him, no," Maggie said, voice flat. "I scared him." They moved fast after that, climbing the back side of the gorge using boulders for cover. At the top, they found blood fresh smeared across the rocks. "Coward's running," Silas said. "No," Maggie corrected. "He's limping." They tracked him to a small hollow, an old hunter's shelter made of logs and tarp, hidden beneath thick fir trees. Smoke curled faintly from a stone-ringed pit. Maggie crept forward, rifle ready. Inside, Cutter sat slumped against the wall, clutching his shoulder. His coat was burned along the side, his skin raw beneath. He didn't reach for a weapon, just grinned. "Took you long enough?" Silas moved to the side gun trained on his chest. "You've got one option," Maggie said. "You surrender. You face Timber Creek justice." Cutter laughed low and hoarse. "Ain't no justice in that town." "You're right," she said. "That's why we came instead." He looked at her eyes, black as tar. "You think this ends with me, and I've got men, others places I've dug into like ticks. Kill me and 10 more crawl out." Maggie's grip tightened. "Then I'll start counting." He spat blood. "You gonna shoot me in cold blood, that who you are now?" She stepped closer. "You killed fathers, burned homes, hunted women and children. You don't get to ask who I am. You think you're clean, you're just like me, Maggie. We're survivors, and surviving means doing what it takes." Her voice didn't rise. "No, surviving means knowing when to stop being afraid." Cutter shifted just slightly. Silas fired. The shot was clean, straight through the chest. Cutter fell back dead before he hit the ground. Maggie stared at the body. She didn't feel relief, not victory, just stillness. Silas lowered his gun. He was never going to surrender. "I know." They stood in silence for a long moment. Then Maggie whispered, "There's no going back to who we were." "No," Silas said. "But maybe we can go forward." They buried Cutter under the rocks. No words. No marker. By the time they returned to the cabin, the kids were waiting on the porch, bundled in blankets. Becky ran to them first, then Ezra, then Annie. Maggie dropped to her knees, arms wrapped around her children, breathing them in. "You came back," Annie whispered. Maggie held her tighter. "Always." Inside, the fire burned bright, and somewhere deep in the woods, the land finally exhaled. But the journey wasn't over yet, because once you've stopped running from your past, the next step is deciding where to build your future. The first thaw came 3 days after they buried Cutter. Snow softened to slush along the ridges, and patches of mud peeked out from beneath the drifts like old secrets. Birds started returning, warbling cautious notes in the trees, as if testing whether it was safe to sing again. Maggie stood in the clearing outside the cabin, arms crossed, watching the sky shift from steel gray to a reluctant blue. She could smell the earth again. After so many weeks of blood and powder and smoke, it almost felt like forgiveness. Inside, Jed had finally started walking on his own again, slow, stiff, but steady. He'd shaved, cleaned the wound on his ribs, and now sat by the fire, sketching something on an old piece of birch bark. Annie perched on a stool nearby, trying to mimic his lines with a stub of charcoal. Becky had been quiet since their return. Not nervous, just thoughtful. She'd taken to sitting at the edge of the woods, with a book open on her lap, eyes always drifting toward the horizon, like she was waiting for something or someone. Silas was gone. Left that morning with nothing but his rifle, a satchel, and a quiet nod goodbye. He's not the settling kind, Jed had said, watching him disappear into the woods. Maggie hadn't argued. She knew it too. Silas had done what he came to do, help them survive, and now that the storm had passed, he'd gone back to the wind. But she still felt the hole he left. That afternoon, Maggie gathered the kids and Becky outside. "We're not staying here," she said, brushing hair from her face. "This place, this cabin, it was never meant to be permanent. It saved us. But it's not home." Becky nodded slowly. Then where Maggie looked toward the ridgeline. "Willard Lorne's place. You said it was safe, Jed." He nodded. "A basin between two hills. Water from a spring. Land for planting. Deer pass through all the time. He offered it to me once, back when I still thought I could outrun peace." Maggie met his eyes. "Maybe it's time we stop running from it." Becky smiled, small but real. "Feels strange to say, but I'm ready." Maggie looked at the kids, then back at the cabin. "We'll leave at first light." They spent the rest of the day packing what little they owned, what mattered most. Blankets, tools, dried beans, a tin box of matches. Maggie wrapped Jed's drawings in cloth. Becky stitched a new strap for the sled. The children helped where they could, their laughter slowly returning like buds before spring. That night, they sat by the fire for the last time. No one said much. There wasn't a need. Outside wind stirred the trees gently, like the world itself was exhaling. Before heading to bed, Maggie walked out into the yard, boots crunching softly over the half-frozen ground. She looked out over the hills, voice quiet. "You can't build a future if you keep burying it under fear." She didn't know if the wind heard her, didn't care. Morning came early. The sled was loaded, packs were strapped. Jed leaned on a walking stick Becky had carved from a piece of oak. His steps were slow but steady. The path to Lorne's land would take them south through the low ravine, then turn across the Silver Pine Creek. 5 days if the weather held. Fewer if they found game. As they left, Maggie glanced back once. The cabin stood in the morning light, smoke curling from the chimney one last time. Not a prison anymore, just a place they passed through. A chapter closed. Ezra tugged her coat. "Mama, yeah. Do you think the next place will have chickens?" She laughed softly. "I sure hope so." They moved quietly, each step lighter than the last. No longer hunted. No longer hiding. Just living. 3 days in, they found a grove of wild plum trees blooming early. Maggie stopped, stared at the pink-white blossoms. Jed walked up beside her, breathing hard. She smiled. "You all right? I'll get there." Becky came up behind them, Annie riding piggyback. "You see something?" Maggie nodded toward the trees. "Hope." They made camp there that night beneath the trees, cooked the last of the beans, watched the fire dance against bark. Jed played a soft tune on a harmonica they thought had been lost. Ezra and Annie danced their boots, scuffing the dirt. Maggie sat close beside Jed, head resting on his shoulder. "Do you think we'll be safe there?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Then safe, maybe not always. But together, that's enough." She looked up at the stars. "I think we finally stopped bleeding." He looked at her, his voice soft. "That's not what matters." She turned to him, puzzled. He smiled. "It's not that we stopped bleeding, Maggie. It's that we learned how to heal." His words sank into her bones. It was true. Every mile, every scar, every gunshot, every tear they hadn't just survived. They'd changed. Hardened, yes, but not broken. The fire crackled. The children laughed. And for the first time in years, Maggie closed her eyes, not in fear, not in exhaustion, but in peace. Tomorrow they'd reach the edge of the basin. The land would stretch wide and empty, waiting for them. And they'd begin again. This time on their terms. The sun rose golden over the ridge, spilling warm light across the basin like honey over bread. The valley stretched wide and quiet below them, blanketed in soft grasses, just beginning to wake from the long winter. The creek shimmered in the distance, threading through the hills like a silver ribbon. Maggie stood at the edge of the bluff, Ezra on her hip, Annie by her side. Her heart beat steady, not from fear, not from urgency, but something simpler, steadier, like roots being set into fresh earth. Behind them, Jed leaned against a pine, the morning breeze tugging at the brim of his hat. Becky sat nearby, unpacking dried corn and flour from the sled, while humming a lullaby. The air smelled like pine needles and new beginnings. Willard Lorne had kept his promise. The land was untouched, remote, sheltered on three sides by hills open to the south where the sun lingered longest. A good place to build, to grow, to live. They made camp beside the creek that day. Jed sketched the land, marking where the cabin might go, where crops could be planted come spring. Becky and Maggie collected stones for a fire ring, their hands moving with purpose. Even the kids seemed to understand the change in the air, no longer just surviving, belonging. That night they didn't talk about the past. They talked about fences, chickens, a garden. Becky mentioned learning to keep bees. Jed joked about raising goats. Ezra said he wanted a treehouse. Annie asked if they could paint it blue. Maggie didn't laugh them off. She promised them yes. In the following days, they cleared brush-stacked stones, dug the first shallow trench for what would become the foundation. The work was hard, backs ached, hands blistered, but no one complained. They were building something worth bleeding for. Maggie spent the mornings walking the land rifle in hand, not out of fear, but habit. Each day the woods seemed less like a threat, and more like a part of her. The birds had returned in full by then. Squirrels, deer, even a fox that watched her from across the creek one morning, before darting away, bushy tail flicking like a challenge. She smiled at the fox. "We're staying," she whispered. "You better get used to us." One evening, Jed found her down by the creek, washing her hands, the sky streaked pink and orange behind her. "You're quiet," he said. "I'm listening," she replied. "To what?" She looked up. "The land. It's not screaming anymore." Jed sat beside her on the bank, dipping his fingers into the water. "You ever think we'd make it here?" Maggie thought for a long moment. "No. Not back then. Back then I thought survival was the best I could ask for. And now..." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Now I want more." He turned toward her. "What kind of more quiet mornings? Laughter that doesn't sound nervous. A table big enough for all of us. The kind of life where nothing explodes in the middle of dinner." He chuckled. "Tall order." She grinned. "You in or not?" He kissed the top of her head. "I've been in since the snow." She closed her eyes, let the creek run over her fingertips. The next weeks blurred in rhythm, waking with the sun working until dusk, sleeping like the dead. They built the frame of the cabin from pine. Becky learned how to mix clay and straw for chinking. Jed crafted a door from salvaged barnwood that Willard had left them in an old shed near the far hill. Silas never returned, but every now and then they'd find signs of him. A snare left reset, a fresh trail leading nowhere. Once a small tin of salt jerky left beside the creek tucked in a hollow log. Maggie never said anything, just pocketed the gift and smiled. "Some men ain't meant to stay," Jed said one evening. "I know," Maggie said, "but that doesn't mean they stop watching over us." By late spring, the cabin stood whole, rough, uneven, but strong. Becky planted squash and beans. Jed taught Annie how to fish. Ezra caught a garter snake and insisted it was his pet now. Maggie let him keep it in a jar for 3 days before convincing him to let it go. On the first warm night in May, they sat on the new porch, a small fire crackling lightning bugs blinking across the fields like drifting stars. Maggie looked at her family, at Jed and Becky, at the kids, at the land, and something inside her settled, like a stone finding its place in the riverbed. Annie crawled into her lap. "Do you think we'll stay here forever?" Maggie looked into her daughter's eyes. "I don't know about forever, but long enough." Annie yawned. "I like it when it's quiet." Maggie pulled her close. "Me too." Later that night, when everyone was asleep, she stood out by the tree line alone. The wind carried the smell of ash wood and fresh dirt. The stars were clearer than they'd ever been. She thought about Ruth and the snow, about the hunger, about the man who said her children would never starve again, about every step it took to get here, every choice, every scar, every scream, and she knew. This wasn't a story about revenge. It was a story about reclamation, about taking back what the world tried to steal: dignity, hope, family, peace. It was about building something after the fire. Not because the pain was gone, but because healing was worth more than hurting. She pressed a hand to her chest, breathed in deep, and whispered, "We survived." But more than that, we lived. That was the difference. That was the ending she chose. Not the silence of fear, but the quiet of peace. Not the scream of vengeance, but the stillness of a home. Not just blood spilled, but roots planted. And tomorrow she would wake up and do it all again, not because she had to, but because now she finally could.